Hello, thank you for attending. My name is Don Fleming. I'm the Senior Education Coordinator here at CASN, and I'm happy to welcome you all to the April session of the 2022 Lunch and Learn series presented by CASN's Research and Scholarship Committee. The three presentations in this series focused on Indigenous research. Many of us are familiar with the concept of lunch and learn, where faculty members come together during their lunch hour to share one another's projects they're working on, to dialogue and to discuss methodologies, successes and challenges that they encountered in their work. And this webinar series is intended to serve as inspiration and networking opportunity for participants while creating the collegial feel of the lunch and learn. We'll be recording today's session. We'll begin with a presentation from our speaker, and we'll conclude with 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A after the presentations. And to submit your question, depending on the size of the group, you could just raise your hand and I'll see it, or use the chat function. So in this session, we'll hear from Erica Sams-Hurley, a faculty member at Memorial University and a PhD candidate at the U of A, University of Alberta. You can read her bio and the description of her presentation on the Lunch and Learn CASN page, which you've probably already done. And her presentation is entitled Research Methodological Approaches and Indigenous People. Erica.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here now. Always takes a second to get set up. Can you see it okay now?
Yes, we can, Erica.
Okay. It's hard when I can't see the chat or anything, just my screen. So my apologies. So as Don introduced, I'm Erica Sams-Hurley, and my title for the discussion today is Research Methodological Approaches and Indigenous People. So what I've done, I just put my name and where I'm from into the chat box, and I'm wondering, and I'm welcoming everyone to do, if they could do the same, or if they'd like to. And basically, I wanted to just create an environment similar to what we use in my culture as a talking circle. You may be familiar with that. And just to say that each nation may have little different teachings around the talking circle. And the circle basically can be used as a ceremonial, more serious type of setting, or it can be used for a more more relaxed type atmosphere. But essentially, there's some of the core things that remain the same when you're having a circle. Basically, the core principles that we're all sat next to each other as equals. No one is above or below anyone else. And that basically that we are sharing, and that this is a safe space. So I want to create a safe space here today. Because when we do talk about Indigenous peoples and topics, sometimes it carries with some of the traumas or some of the questions that individuals still hold. And basically, I just want to say that when we're engaging today with each other in the chat or after, just to be mindful of all questions are welcomed. Just think about how you're phrasing those questions, and that it's coming from a good place. I'll also start off by saying I don't know everything, definitely don't. I'm just happy to be able to share and to be with you today to discuss some of the knowledge and stuff that I've been lucky enough to be honored to carry. And that I am also here today, and I always have my ancestors with me. So I like to acknowledge them. So if you want to take a minute and acknowledge someone that you feel is with you, you can do that as well. So it could be just someone that comes to mind just suddenly as we're discussing this now. And just to think about them in for that moment. Also, in talking about Indigenous people and some of the things that we associate with in terms of creating a good atmosphere is, for my culture, smudging. So I've already smudged myself before coming on here today, but I'm also going to just kind of smudge the area a little bit more and do that as I begin this conversation. And the idea is that, again, everyone, excuse me, has different teachings and knowledge around smudging, and that not every nation does it. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we move forward in our discussions, is that one fits all approach doesn't work or isn't true. So just a bit of an outline. You'll notice that the discussion today kind of flows between these kind of headings or major topics, but I wanted to set out a little bit of an outline for you. So introduction, discussion around First Peoples and nursing. What is research? Methodological underpinnings, my research journey, and then moving forward. And I wish I could see the chat here. I can't see it on my screen, just to kind of highlight some of the areas that everyone is from, whether that's where your family is from or where you're situated currently. But I just want to acknowledge that. So I'm taught in my culture to first introduce oneself, and this kind of grounds us and connects us to each other in that type of relational accountability. So for me, my parents are Jim and Gail Sams, and I'm from Mount Moriah, a small community on the west coast of Newfoundland within the Bay of Islands area. It's literally on the mountain. So I'm connected to my Mi'kmaq community and my ancestry through both my parents, my mother and father. I do have a stronger connection through my father's side, his parents were really grounded within the culture, who were Wilson and Yvonne Sams from Benoit's Cove. But really my connection goes through my grandfather's family, and his family is from Flat Bay on the west coast of Newfoundland. My Grammy Webb, his grandmother, Mary Frances Webb, she was what you would call nowadays a midwife. She was a traditional Mi'kmaq healer and cared for hundreds of people on the west coast, delivering hundreds of babies. And Grammy Webb was also the last known fluent Mi'kmaq speaker here on the west coast. So she carried that as well. So me personally, I've always straddled and been between these two worlds in which I grew up in. So I was very grounded in my values and beliefs and things that were instilled within me at an early age. But then I was also going to school and within this westernized academy and within this westernized world, really. So like many Indigenous people, this type of two world spheres that kind of played in my life has been something that I've examined throughout for many years, which is interesting. But ultimately, at a young age, I knew that I wanted to be involved with helping and healing other people. So It may be something connected to my Grammy Webb and my family history, but essentially I was drawn to nursing. I always loved the idea of continued knowledge, being able to move within the profession and have different aspects of nursing. So along my nursing journey, I started out when I first graduated from here on the West Coast in 2004, and I started working on the units, on various units, and I did that for a while. But then eventually I was drawn to nursing education. So I started working with the Western Regional School of Nursing with the full campus from Memorial University. And it was through that experience whereby I eventually went back to school to get my master's of nursing. So in that particular journey, I was at a point in time where I was looking at research, and my thesis was basically what works with the school, what can I do that's, you know, not easy, but something that was relative and that kind of thing. So I ended up doing a thesis on high fidelity simulation of pediatric learning, which was great learning, and I enjoyed that. But as time went on, my real passion for Indigenous issues and Indigenous people led me to PhD program, whereby my dissertation is around work with Mi'kmaq women. So it started out with Indigenous women, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so really that whole journey into the program has been quite the experience. And what I'd like to talk about next is something that First Nations or Indigenous people or whoever struggle with a lot is terminology. So I'm now going to discuss who are First Peoples. And it starts off by really understanding this terminology and this basically relationship between words and Indigenous people. So First Peoples, we get Métis, we have Inuit, we have First Nation. Those are the common terminology used, but ultimately that overall arching word of Indigenous now is used. And it's moved through time from Indian to Aboriginal to Native to Indigenous. And one of the first things people say to me in conversations a lot of time once we get talking is, I don't want to offend anyone. I don't know what to call someone or what terms to use. And basically, I would just say that's the first step, is to recognize this use of language and terminology and to question it, and just do so in a safe way and a heartful way. So, you know, breaking down the understanding of First Nations or even status and non-status individuals, that creates such a divide within not only Canada, but specifically within our healthcare system. Understanding that status versus non-status individuals can be brother and sister. It means that one is recognized under a sexist, racist piece of legislation known as the Indian Act, which has been a piece of policy and work that has worked against Indigenous people. And that basically that continued hurt being taught into that, and that language is really important. So those terms are colonial in nature, and basically how people generally talk in our communities is that I would identify myself as a Mi'kmaq. I'm an Ilnu, meaning part of the Mi'kmaq people, my people. And that's kind of how we talk about ourselves. And by using these more generalized terminologies, is that you're starting to lump individuals into this one category, and that one size does not fit all. And this is where it starts to get tricky. So what I wanted to break it down into also was one of the most important things that I say to individuals is that we have to start the conversation before colonization. So I always like to discuss how we need to identify and recognize the unique and really complex systems that all Indigenous peoples, all nations really had before settlers arrived. We had our own unique way of health and healing, networks of how to exchange goods and services between each other, ways that we looked at things, and even that research or how we basically survived, right? So that's really important to recognize, because once we had settlers arriving, even in the initial beginnings, there was this peaceful exchange. There was this mutual relationship. We have treaties, and that's one of the things that if you're not familiar with certain things I'm speaking of today, such as the Indian Act, treaties, like some of those are the core things that I would always encourage individuals to gain more knowledge about. Because a treaty is the actual documentation and recognition that there's two sovereign nations agreeing, and in the case of our treaties, to agree to mutually coexist side by side next to each other while not causing harm or detriment to each other. So just coexisting and naturally. But unfortunately, as time went on, that did change that process. So looking at nursing and, the role of individuals who were providing care to people in the beginning, really, they were working with Indigenous people side by side. Is documented, and there's research been done about how that sharing was occurring, because really we were the people who knew the lands, what plants to use, what different types of methods to care for different situations. So it was kind of that mutual understanding and respect working together. As that shift occurred, it became more of, well, this knowledge, I appreciate that knowledge. I'm going to take this and use it. I don't agree with that knowledge, or I don't understand it, so that's rubbish. We're not going to use it. So basically, settlers would decide to take certain information from Indigenous people that they worked with and to build on that knowledge. So that did occur. So then this shift whereby Indigenous people were less than occurred, and the idea around being savages, and that they were back in time and they weren't advanced, and those types of things occurred. And unfortunately, some of the thoughts and some of the core things that are systemic racist thoughts are still occurring today, and we have to recognize that. And the fact that colonization is still occurring. So some researchers and individuals will refer to post-colonization, as opposed to other, I know Indigenous authors will argue against that and say, how can we speak in those terms in that form when colonization is definitely still occurring, especially to our people? So one article that I want to highlight in particular is up on the screen, and I apologize if I don't pronounce the name correctly. Simic and et al. Are the authors, and it looks at the search of truth, uncovering nursing's involvement in colonial harms and similar policies 5 years post Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this article is really interesting because they look at 5 key things, which were Indian hospitals, residential schools, child apprehension, forced sterilization, and murdered and missing Indigenous women and Two-Spirit individuals. Those are some of the key topics. That's not all of them, obviously, but what they identify and what they say is that as they shift through the literature, what became evident is that the most talked about things within the research and within the articles were mental health issues, violence, and substance use for Indigenous people. So that real shift towards strength-based approaches and moving from the negative terminology to more positive discussions is not evident to be occurring as we thought it would be right now. And they also identified 2 main barriers within nursing, stopping that moving forward. And they identified the image of nursing and the anti-Indigenous racism. And through their examination, they said 2 of the most common questions that nurses are still stuck on, and we ask, is how do we enact reconciliation? And how do we move forward? And those are big questions. One of the quotes I'll just read quickly. It says, without widely and deeply examining nursing's role within colonial health systems that have and continue to perpetuate harm, the profession will locate itself as committed to reconciliation, but not complacent to the truth. A lot of this uncovering the truth of nursing's role within harms that have occurred throughout history since settlers arrived and colonization is not occurring, in that basically this colonial construct and that colonization that's occurring is embedded within our structures, our systems, and our policies that are still ingrained within even nursing practice. Oops, sorry about that. So my computer seems to want to have them on its own there. So as colonization is still impacting, nursing and moving forward with truth and reconciliation, it's still shaping and impacting that age-old question of what is research? What is knowledge? What is that idea of what constitutes knowledge? So really what I want to highlight is that language really matters, because it's how someone interprets and understands something, and that meaning behind it that really impacts their thoughts and their actions and how they move forward. I'll give you an example. So for my own purposes with my research, and I'll talk more about my own process in a moment, I started asking questions around my own language, and I couldn't find a word for research. So it led me to talking to a knowledge keeper that I know, a language keeper. And I asked, is there a word for research, or like this search inquiry in our language, our Mi'kmaq language? And they said, no, it doesn't exist. And we had a conversation which really opened my eyes and grounded me at that moment, is that we didn't ask the question and expect that answer. That's not our process. The way that we worked is that we're in this relational understanding with all things, and that it's a process, and it's more or less a journey. So really questioning what is research versus Indigenous research versus really what is just Indigenous ways is really important when we're talking about moving forward. Therefore, a lot of my journey has been looking at research and understanding what if we put our hearts first, and kind of changing that landscape of what we understand research to look like. And I think we're starting that. We are. And I think it's Indigenous scholars, Sean Wilson and other people before that have pushed some boundaries, and are continuing to work towards change. But I think it has to be a collective thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So just a little bit about my own research journey to tie it in here. And my own experience is that when I first went into the program, I started out with a really, what I thought again was a standard research question. And it just so happened that I entered a PhD program actually because a coworker, faculty member contacted me about research and kind of like put that into my mind about, well, why don't you apply to your PhD, to a PhD program? I think that's something that's needed and you should think about it. And I really did think about it, and I started calling around, and it just so happened that I was accepted into the program. So what I was first looking at was Indigenous women and cardiovascular disease and thoughts around that. But then as I started, even that research question didn't sit right with me as I continued on. So I started taking courses and working more towards hammering down that dissertation, and moving forward into that process. And what really helped were really supportive supervisors, I have to say, because they pushed me to use my voice to talk about these struggles that I was experiencing. So what happened was I eventually changed my question to just what are Mi'kmaq women's thoughts of heart? So moving away from that just physiological, okay. So I'm not sure if I went into my own research journey experience, but I'll pick up here. But basically, in conclusion for this particular part is that I was saying we really need to examine Indigenous research in a different way if we're really positioning Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and really going to engage in that type of relationship and understanding moving forward. So like I'm not sure if you heard, but in my own research journey, I moved along questioning a lot of the standard things and terminology that was used. So is it narrative inquiry? Is it qualitative in nature? Is it, you know, all these, what type of methods are you using? Are you interviewing? And nothing was really fitting. So what happened was I kind of changed my topic altogether. I'm scared to move along. I hope you guys can see this one. So basically, it led me down to talking to my supervisor, and having a supportive supervisor is so important. I would say that it was based on that support that I could really start using my voice, and I was encouraged to do that and to speak up. So through a lot of conversation, basically what I ended up with was understanding that positioning my understanding of knowledge and Umsignogama, which really means all my relations, loosely in English. It's a saying, it's a prayer, it's very deeply connected to who we are and has a lot of meaning. And basically that understanding grounded me to really start questioning things about how research is interpreted. So I had this paper that came out of this special topics course that we developed looking at positionality and identity in Indigenous research. Because I kept saying, you know, like, I really am going to know these women. Basically, I'm part of this community, so I know certain things. I'll be able to pick up on if a woman wears a particular skirt to a discussion that probably holds meaning, whether it's intentional or not, and I can explore it from that perspective. So really, I started looking at the understanding even of bias in research and our understanding as Indigenous people, really, how am I going to engage in this, and ethics, and not to say that academic and institutional ethical boards and the processes, there's anything wrong with that. But what I'm saying is there's another Indigenous ethical community responsibility that kind of supersedes in a lot of our understanding over that. And they really need to work in alignment. So from this, I basically moved along and looked at all these different terminologies and where my research would fit. So it was community-centered, but I had to understand that my Mi'kmaq worldview really guided it all. Even though we call it Indigenous research and the Indigenous research methodology, it was community-based, participatory, it was co-created, and it used story works by Joanne Archibald. But really, what I was getting at and what I was starting to unpack was really this understanding that we have to look at this Indigenous paradigm or worldview through our lens and who we are as Indigenous people. So if I put Umsignogama and my understanding of that relational responsibility, physical, spiritual, emotional, all those aspects into this kind of a research agenda moving forward, basically the unpacking is to understand that we have community at the center. And I really liked the way that Dr. Lori Lambert kind of had this conceptual model whereby it says research is from a place, your heart, your voice. Why want to do the research? And ask that to yourself, why am I doing this? So is it tribal or cultural specific, and your voice and passion? So I really like that. So while they're positioning community, you're part of the community and you're at the center of this spider web of understanding. And into the web, she has different aspects, which is important, ethics and respect, tribal protocols with elders or your council, survival, recovery, moving the community past trauma or working with them in their trauma. So all these things are really interconnected. So then really, if you look at it, and my understanding moving forward, is it really Indigenous research methodology, or is that just a terminology that some people can understand and relate with? Because each individual and nation, each community will have different ways of Indigenous knowing, being, and doing. So each research, when it's done, can look quite different. So understanding that is really important. So ultimately, that is to say, through my research journey, changing my perspective and really realigning my question to look at Mi'kmaq women's thoughts around heart has really created that main question, but also questions around my understanding of what is Mi'kmaq research and research for each individual person who is Indigenous moving forward. So what I've learned is that through my research, I've had to examine my own traumas and look at myself as part of this journey with these women. Part of StoryWorks is understanding that now, as the women share their stories with me, I have a responsibility to respect these stories, and what I do with these stories is a responsibility on me. And this is kind of interconnected and ingrained in who I am anyways, but it just, StoryWorks puts it into like a kind of like a framework or understanding. So really what I've started to question is, let's start following with heart versus looking for answers around heart. So really leading by what I feel is right. And I'm going to play this again for you because you couldn't hear last time. I'd love for everyone to just take a moment and just and just sit with that for a moment. The idea behind playing those sounds is to understand that research and that journey is not just a process of getting through steps or getting to that answer. It should be more about the journey of getting there and how it makes you feel, taking in all the different aspects and really reflecting on that and making that part of that research and understanding. So here, there's two things that I really liked for visuals. Was one from the Government of Canada Strategic Direction for Indigenous Research on the purpley, and the other one is Cooper et al., who had it under a journal article, When Research is Relational. So both of these kind of highlight some of the important things to consider is around building relationships. And lasting relationships, not just relationships for a particular research project. Supporting research priorities for Indigenous people, recognizing and respect Indigenous sovereignty, benefits to Indigenous community, emphasis on place. These are all very important in understanding and moving forward with what we consider research. I get asked this a lot. Well, how do we move forward? What do we do differently in nursing or in research in general? And there's just a couple of takeaways that I have for you right now, based on my own experience and the little knowledge I have, is support Indigenous voices. So in the past, sometimes people go searching for the answer that they want, and as opposed to just asking the question and taking in what the answer is. So supporting Indigenous voice and recognizing lived experience. So someone who has actually lived and is part of the community and grew up with those different worldviews and really situates themselves. So in support is giving a seat and a voice to these individuals, which means supporting change throughout all levels. So on different committees and leadership positions, and creating that space for Indigenous people, and recognizing that sometimes that knowledge is from an elder is just as important and valuable as like someone who holds a PhD, depending on their experience and what they bring. I would say sitting on different committees while challenging the status quo. Just because something has been done this way and this is the way that it's set up doesn't mean it always has to be that way. And listening to why, change may be really important within that particular situation. But ultimately, I think it starts with truth. And we talk about reconciliation and moving forward. And I believe that it needs to start with everybody, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together, move forward in that truth, to acknowledge that there are different knowledges and experiences, and that they are valuable, and that individuals need to move past how we gain knowledge. So this is great today, being able to sit and talk to you guys via this method, but also getting out into community, interacting with powwows and informally and formally into community, and creating those relationships that will last when there's research projects that you want to engage in or be part of. And just ultimately, let's look at research different. And what does that mean for nursing? How can we help this shape the future of nursing, and how we can all collectively move forward together? So that's it for my presentation. Walaliok, thank you. And I'm sorry for any technical issues that came up, but thanks so much.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Yeah, technical issues, whatever. So it's 2 minutes till the official end time, but if we can, if Erica's willing to stick around for a while, that'd be great. So if you have any questions, you could send them in the chat, or just, there aren't too many folks, you could just raise your hand or just speak up, whatever you prefer.
Hi, Erica.
Leticia.
Hi, Eric. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I'm looking forward to getting the slides because it was kind of hard to see. They were so miniature. But I missed the very beginning because I was one of those people that, so what was the original focus of your research that you ended up taking the step back to think about moving forward from your heart position? But I don't know what the, I'm sorry, I missed it. So I don't know what the focus was.
That's okay. And I'm sorry, technology, but it started out, it was just, I went with kind of like an easier topic, which was just Indigenous women and cardiovascular disease. And it was very physiological in nature, but that's not how we think, and that's not how I really understand heart in general. So it changed to more specifically, what I knew was Mi'kmaq women and their thoughts around heart.
And did you publish your outcomes?
Right now, I'm still within collecting information and into my writing. What I did show was a paper that I did write, questioning positionality and identity in research. And I'm also in the midst of co-authoring a paper on place in nursing and what does that mean, our understanding of place in practice. And yeah, which was really interesting and great conversations to have. Yeah.
Yeah, be interesting. I used to run a critical care unit. So hearing your perspective on, and the women's perspective on cardiac, I don't know, disease or heart or how it affects their life would be really interesting. I'll look forward to that.
I'll just say that I knew, and I had an idea because being an Indigenous woman myself, trauma definitely comes into play, and not only lived trauma, but blood knowledge that we talk about and things that are passed on from generation to generation also comes into play when we talk about heart and heart health. So I think that's going to be really interesting as we move forward, and something definitely to explore more.
The concept has grown, from the original focused. You know, the concept seems to expand when you take the step back and see it from their perspective. Do you
Yeah,
find?
definitely.
Yep.
Yeah. And part of my own understanding was that being taught within the same Westernized kind of structure is that I was taught to do it this way, and you had to be separate and, you know, reflect all the time about what does that mean. And, you know, like, while we do reflecting, but reflecting can be with an elder. It can be in a different kind of situation than what we're not necessarily used to in academia. So really stepping back and really just allowing myself to think from my perspective and the women's perspective has really changed the way that the research would have unfolded 100%.
Thank you. Congratulations. It's good.
Oh, thank you.
There are lots of thank yous in the chat, Erica.
Oh, thank you very much.
Anybody else have a question or comment? Okay, seeing none. Thank you again, Erica, very much for this presentation. And as I said, we'll have it on our YouTube channel. I'll send around a link to everybody registered. As you can, not everybody's attended registered, but they wanted to hear what you have to say. So I'll send that link around. And then thank you thank you, Erica, and thank you for attending. And our next Lunch and Learn series, we're in the process of developing them for next fall. So you know, stay tuned. That's where it's stay tuned.